Welcome into the Tech Ed Podcast. I am your host, Matt Kirchner. I had the honor, and I mean it sincerely, the honor last year of serving in my home state of Wisconsin on the Joint Legislative Study Committee on the regulation of artificial intelligence. We're going to get into that and many other things with today's guest. He is an iconic politician and figure here in the state of Wisconsin and beyond. We're going to learn not just about what he's doing politically, but how he got to where he is. Fascinating backstory has Senator Julian Bradley from the great state of Wisconsin. Senator, such an honor to have you here. Thanks for coming into the studio.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Excited to do the podcast today.
Yeah, super, super excited. You're a high energy guy. You've got great stories. You've got a great background, and I know we're going to have an absolutely great time. So as I suggested in the intro, really interesting background. What inspires a guy like Julian Bradley to get into politics in the first place?
Yeah, so growing up, my mom was very involved. And one of the things that she would frequently do is take me along for like door knocking and
involved politically, you're saying?
Very involved in politics and in policymaking and influencing. So we would go around and they would do house parties, back in like the early and mid 80s.
Okay.
There would frequently be house parties where you go around and you're supporting whichever candidate.
Sure.
My mom was a staunch Democrat.
I went to house parties back then, but they had nothing to do with politics. That's a different story. Go on.
Yeah. And so that's what they would do. And my mom took me along for the ride and really started to pique my interest. She was very involved, very community minded and engaged. And she always told me that it was my responsibility to do the same.
Yeah,
right?
awesome.
And as I grew up and I got older, I got more involved in my own journey toward politics. Sure. Different political party than my mother.
For sure. That happens.
That does happen. And I was glad to be able to do that. But one of the things that really led me to going from being like a volunteer and an advocate for candidates to jumping into the ring, if you will, literacy.
Okay.
First and foremost.
Yep.
I mean, I grew up living well below the poverty line.
Okay.
And I think
whereabouts, by the way, geographically?
So I was born in Baltimore, and then I spent the first 11 years of life in Lexington Park, which is in southern Maryland.
Got it.
Then we moved here to the great state of Wisconsin, over in the La Crosse area.
When you were still young?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. At the end of fifth grade.
Okay. Got it.
And so for me, the biggest difference between where I am today and where some of the people that I grew up with, where they are, and some of them, my childhood best friends, no longer alive.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. It's the fact that my mom focused on making sure I could read. We grew up, again, well below the poverty line. I hate to use the word poor, but
I hear you.
That's why I repeat that line. But
sure.
It was such a big deal to be able to read and not just look at a word and recognize it, right? But comprehend its meaning.
Yep.
And to know that through comprehension, my current circumstance is not what my future circumstance has to be.
Interesting.
And that's what really kind of like woke my mind up. And my mom reminded me constantly that, yes, we're not doing too well right now, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Awesome.
You can fight through that. You can work through it and things like that. And as I got older and I realized, I believe that message wasn't getting to everybody. Not everybody had a mom like that that was pushing them.
Yeah, right.
Right. And so that's what drew me in and said, we need to make some real changes. And I want to be involved in this because if we're going to seriously address poverty, if we're going to seriously address crime, then we have to seriously address literacy.
Absolutely.
You grow up in poverty, your whole world's like a 12-block radius.
Yep.
Right? I've read to kids down in the city of Milwaukee that don't know there's a body of water anywhere near.
Right. Isn't that crazy?
You just can't imagine that because their whole world is such a small area. But as soon as you open up the mind, as soon as you get into comprehension and you realize that maybe the path your parents took or your friends are taking or other family members are taking towards crime isn't what you have to do. There is a whole nother world and it's available to you.
Yep.
That changes outcomes. We can't get to everybody, right? Because there's choice.
Right, for sure.
But we can open up minds and give people more choices. And that's what brought me in. It's literacy first and foremost.
Yeah.
That's how we can attack crime. That's how we can attack poverty. And that's why I do what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee, Wauwatosa, in upper middle class family, fair to say, but spent a ton of time. The church that we went to was on 48th and Nash, and also lifeguarded on 9th and Brown here in the city of Milwaukee. And so the exposure that I got early in my life, to your point, really in a lot of cases, people that had their whole life ahead of them, but didn't recognize necessarily what was possible. I was blessed with two parents that set a great example for me through my entire life. You set expectations, and I didn't always meet them. And I got I felt the result of that when I didn't meet them. But you take for granted sometimes if you have a mother like you did. Maybe you didn't take it for granted, but I certainly did. You have a mother like you did that was setting these expectations, that was saying, all right, this is the opportunity. And we might not be in the perfect place now, but that doesn't mean that you can't figure out a way to get to where that perfect place could be. Not that we ever get to the perfect place, but you're making tremendous progress. And a lot of that was through, I'll be honest with you, Senator, we've had other senators on the podcast, both federally and at the state level. You're the first professional wrestler, I think, that we've had join us on the Tech Ed podcast. So tell us a little bit about that, this whole decision you made about how you could support your family and create a lifestyle and a future for yourself that's obviously led you to the position of a senator here in the great state of Wisconsin. Talk about that journey a bit.
Yeah, happy to. I'm shocked I'm the first pro wrestler. I thought it was natural to...
You won't be the last, I promise.
I thought it was like, grow up, graduate high school, become a pro wrestler, run for Senate. I thought that was the normal track.
Get involved in the tech sector, what have you. Exactly.
Right. No, so, I was always a fan of wrestling, always a huge fan of wrestling. And, I graduated high school in 99. In the mid-90s, student loans and the availability weren't what they are today, certainly.
Yep.
And I knew I wanted to go to college. I knew that for sure. I was going to be the first to do that in my family. I wanted to do that. But around like 95, 96, I started looking and thinking, okay, I'm going to have to get a job and I'm going to have to pay for things.
Right.
And I'm a big dude. And I started thinking, man, I wonder if I could do this. Wrestling was getting super popular again. And so I started making calls back to the East Coast to wrestling schools. And I found one that said, graduate high school and come on out.
So there are wrestling schools?
There are, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. And so the biggest school that I went to, the name that everybody really recognizes, was run by the Anawaihi family, which is the Rocks family.
Okay.
Afa Anawaihi, who passed away last year, ran WXW Wild Samoan Training Center. I was broken in by a guy named Captain Rick Adams. He kind of gave me my start.
Yeah.
And then obviously Afa the Wild Samoan kind of polished me up and got me ready, put me on TV. And
do you just get in, or do you have to apply, or how does that process?
There's a whole process, right? Like, it's very physical and physically demanding. So there's an entire training regimen. They give you a little tryout and then they say, okay, let's see what you can do. And you have to earn, back then you had to earn the right to even step foot in the ring. Right. And so you pay a bunch of dues and I don't just mean financially. I mean, you're carrying people's bags, you're putting the ring up by yourself, you're tearing it down by yourself, carrying it up and down the stairs. There's a lot that goes into before you get a chance to actually wrestle. And I had a blast. But, I had an absolute blast. I wouldn't say I was able to support my family. That was the goal.
Okay.
So the whole goal was, I'm going to go be a pro wrestler. I'm going to make $1 million, right? And buy my mom a house. I had the whole plan. Didn't really work out that way, but I had a lot of fun and I learned a lot of lessons. And it prepared me for politics, right? Because in wrestling, just like in politics, sometimes people view you as a good guy or a bad guy.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
So it makes it kind of an easier transition, but it was a lot of fun.
Very, very cool. So when I was in your office a month or so ago, and you've got this gigantic belt, right?
Yes.
Hanging on the wall. Tell me what that, I meant to ask you what that is when we were together. What is that?
So that was the first title that I ever won.
Okay.
20 years old. I won my first heavyweight championship. I won the belt twice. And after it got retired, I reached out and I said, can I have it? And they said, no.
Really?
And I said, well, can I buy it?
Yeah.
And so I was able to buy the belt and now it's displayed. It's just a cool reminder that I did something cool as a kid. I had a passion. I knew I liked it. I was able to accomplish it. It was a lot of fun. And I ultimately got inducted into the WXW Wrestling Hall of Fame, which was a pretty cool thing.
Yeah,
I didn't get to WrestleMania to perform, but I still was able to achieve some level of success. And I just made a lot of great friends and great relationships, had a lot of fun, and provided a whole lot of entertainment to people. I got to portray a bad guy, and that was pretty fun.
Yeah, for sure. And your wrestling name was?
Before I give you the answer of what the name was, let's set the stage because everybody goes, where'd that come from?
All right.
So Chris Farley, right? Yeah. Everybody knows Chris Farley, especially here in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
so he did the SNL sketch with Patrick Swayze where they were a Chippendale, right?
Yeah.
And so that character was hilarious.
Right.
Well, I saw that one day and I go, I want to do that character.
That's awesome.
So that was my wrestling character. And I even took the name Chris, but I spelled it differently.
Got it.
So my wrestling name was Hot Chocolate Chris Crude.
Oh, cool.
Chris and Crude with K's because there was an old school wrestler, Ravishing Rick Rude.
Okay.
So I took the Rude, added a K to that, and I took the Chris from Chris Farley, who was my inspiration.
Yeah, awesome.
And just created a hilarious character. He was technically the bad guy, but it was comic relief. That was my role.
I had no idea that was the inspiration for the name. So that's and it's interesting. We had Eric Newman. He's a executive producer in Hollywood on Netflix. He did 0 Day with Robert De Niro, came out. Painkiller with Matthew Broderick. He did Griselda, he did Narcos, and we talked all about his experience in Hollywood. And one of the first films that he did as a producer was with David Spade and Chris Farley, and actually talked on the podcast about what a sweet guy Chris was, and obviously gone way too soon.
Yeah.
And by total coincidence, last night I had a Chris Farley conversation. I was at Marquette University, my alma mater, and we were talking. Chris, of course, went to Marquette for several years, and so we were talking about the crossover that some of the folks had with Chris Farley. Interestingly enough, the topic of the conversation last night, I sat on a panel about artificial intelligence, in that case in business and human resources, and you and I have had all these conversations about AI. Our audience should know that I was honored, as I mentioned in the introduction, to serve on the Joint Legislative Study Committee on the Regulation of Artificial Intelligence. You were the chair of that committee, and thank you, first of all, for nominating me. It was such a great opportunity, and we learned so much. Talk a little bit about the work of that committee before we get into some of the details on AI. And by the way, I'm going to take right now the greatest credit in the history of broadcasting for segueing from professional wrestling to artificial intelligence, right? So we got there, and tell us about the study committee.
Yeah, well done. So the study committee, the conversation started happening around the Capitol that we wanted to have one, and you nailed the title. It was regarding the regulation of artificial intelligence.
Right.
And as soon as I heard that, I got nervous because I said, well, look at what the 3 C states are doing, right? You look at California, Colorado, and Connecticut.
Yep.
There's a lot of issues going on with the laws that they were passing. And so we reached out and said, I would really like to chair this committee.
Okay.
And the reason I wanted to chair it is because I knew I wasn't going to pass any laws out of it. So frequently these study committees come together and they pump out a bunch of bills.
Right.
And I was afraid that would happen with this one.
Right.
And so that was my plan from day one, was to make sure we don't follow in their steps. Let's learn from what they've done.
And we did.
That was the goal. So that's why I did it. That's why it was a long summer. It was a very busy summer.
It was.
We got to travel the whole state, right? We brought in stakeholders from everywhere, all across our state, rather than just positioning ourselves in the Capitol and having people come to us. We went to them.
Healthcare, public safety, education.
Absolutely. Because we had to learn. If we're going to actually be active learners, we can't just do it when people can drive to Madison.
Exactly.
We have to go to where they are. And that was my goal with the committee, to open it up and to build a foundation so that future legislatures can look at this information and go, we did hear about that. They did study that.
Right.
Here's why they didn't take action, or here's some areas they thought we could take action in the future.
Right.
That was my goal. And I think mission accomplished.
Yeah, well, there's no question about it. I joined you when you reported out to the legislative committee and talked a little bit about the results of the study and the fact that we ultimately did not recommend any regulation. Why, even going into it, is it so important that we are really careful about the guardrails that we create around AI, and both ways, right? I mean, because there's concerns. I mean, there's all these dystopian theories and these scary stories that you hear about what could happen, right? So we're certainly not saying that there isn't some risk there. Why was it so important at a state level to you that we not regulate it?
We need artificial intelligence. We have a population problem, and that population problem is we don't have enough people.
Right.
There are job shortages in every industry. I've literally met with daycare providers and funeral home directors.
Yeah.
From cradle to grave.
Yeah, literally.
And they are short everywhere in between as well. We need artificial intelligence to help make up for where we don't have people. And in order to get that to happen, we have to make sure that we're not over-regulating.
Right.
Because once a law gets passed and we start over-regulating, it is really difficult to undo that.
Right.
So let's take our time. Let's make sure we know what we're doing. There are other states that have rushed a little too far ahead. We don't want to stifle innovation.
Right.
We want to be the cradle of innovation. So let's let people come in here and then take care of some of the issues that you talked about, that we talked about as a committee as well.
Right. Consumer
protection, data privacy, all of those things are vitally important, but we can take care of them one at a time without sweeping blanket regulation that stops everything from happening.
So let's look at the other side of the spectrum. You mentioned the 3 C states, and some of the most poignant testimony that I remember hearing was when the folks from Colorado joined us and talked about the legislation that had been passed, the regulations that they do have. What are some of the challenges that we saw in individual states that had decided to regulate AI? And in the process of talking about that, I think it'll become apparent to the audience why it's so important that we're really careful about what we do there.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest pieces, especially when it comes to state regulation, is the fact that you're asking companies to have a different plan for each state.
Yep.
Right. A lot of those things really should be addressed at the federal level.
For sure.
If I had to pick one big thing, that's it.
Yep.
I mean, even from Colorado alone, it was, now we can't do things here in Colorado.
Right.
So we'll have a 49 state plan and then a 1 state specific. they're not going to do it that way. Instead, they're just not going to do Colorado.
Yep.
Right. And so they're going to leave those states in the dust. They're going to fall behind, and they're not going to be ready for their workforce. They're not going to be ready for their constituency, and they're going to fall behind. And nobody wants to be able to do that. Nobody wants to have to do that, rather. Right. We've got to avoid that. And that was our goal.
Absolutely. And so and I think you make the perfect point. You think about a company that's thinking about doing business in a specific state. And if you've got all these different rules, every state has a different rule, then you probably have to comply with all 50 states, right? You think about sales taxes in a business, right? If I'm doing business in a state and I've got nexus with that state, I've got to have 50 different rules for my 50 different states. But if there's one or two states that are doing it, the easy solution for a company is to just say, all right, well, we don't need that state. We'll concentrate on the other 48 or 49. And the folks that end up suffering are the people in that state that would have otherwise benefited from the presence of that company there. So along the way, and we ultimately didn't recommend any legislation, but we learned a ton of really cool stuff, right? I mean, I remember conversations about public safety and preventing things like school shootings, the hearing on healthcare in particular. Dr. Brian Kay, who's a former guest on the podcast from Rogers Behavioral Health, came in and gave some great testimony about AI and mental health. What were some of the things that you heard over the course of those hearings? And these were hours-long hearings, right? We would sit sometimes for 3 or 4 hours and hear testimony. Are there a few things, Senator, that stand out to you that's like, wow, I didn't realize that, or that's a really interesting understanding that came out of the work that we did?
Yeah, so you nailed the first one, public safety. And some of the things that are tied to public safety are things I never thought of.
Yeah.
I never thought of what could be done. And I know it's being piloted right now.
Right.
Waukesha Tech College is going through and piloting the school shooting stuff. And that could be a game changer.
That's awesome. And I didn't realize that. So Rich Barnhouse, who's also been a guest on the podcast, his institution is piloting that technology.
Yes.
That's news to me. That's awesome.
They're leading on this. And so just learning about that and learning other ways that public safety and law enforcement are impacted by artificial intelligence.
Right.
That was a big eye-opener. Healthcare.
Yep.
And the way that we can become more efficient. And the fears that people had too, alleviating those fears. Because I was one of those people as well that would go, well, how do I know when I'm actually talking to a person versus a bot?
Yep.
We have doctors because we need that personal touch. A doctor looks at you and knows, well, that doesn't look right. Whereas, artificial intelligence might say, oh, that's fine. And hearing the fail-safes that they've built in to make sure those things don't happen was great. It was good to hear that. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that it stays that way. Right. But learning all of the different ways that healthcare can be impacted, because mostly people think about manufacturing and automation and things like that. And those are huge. But I was familiar with those coming into the hearings. Learning public safety and healthcare, those are the two biggest that they just blew me away.
Yep, absolutely. And those were my two big takeaways as well. I participated in the education one virtually, and that part of it, obviously, given the work that we do, is really, really near and dear to us. And so many applications in education as well. But your leadership on that committee was absolutely phenomenal. I know it took a tremendous amount of your time. We learned a lot. We learned a lot about things we need to be concerned about, but also reasons for optimism. As you look to the future, Senator, and you think about whether it's government, whether you think it's about the businesses that are in your district or your constituents, what gives you the most reason for optimism, and what are some of those exciting things that are happening in the world of AI?
Yeah. I am not a scientist and I'm not a computer scientist, so I can't accurately predict a lot of those things. But as a policymaker and as somebody that's always looking to the future, the Wisconsin motto is forward.
Right.
And that's what I'm always looking to. And I don't think you can look forward without including AI.
For sure.
Again, we have a population shortage problem.
Yep.
And artificial intelligence is going to help us continue to provide the services that people expect without an additional hopefully increased price as we continue to swap people, because that's what's happening. Companies are losing people as they're bouncing around.
For sure.
That's normal. That's part of a market, but we're seeing less services and we're seeing higher prices.
Yep.
AI can help backfill that and maybe even make it better. Right. And I think there's a lot of optimism for that as we begin to move forward. We haven't even scratched the surface of what we can do yet. And I think that's super exciting. I don't think we have to worry as much about the Terminator and all of the things that everybody seems to like to talk about when they think of AI. There are certainly concerns, but I think we have the best and the brightest people making sure those concerns are adequately addressed, because they're in it for the right reasons.
For sure.
Right? They're trying to solve a problem. And as long as we continue to focus on solving and addressing problems and using this as the tool that it's meant to be, there's nowhere but up to go. And that's super exciting for now.
Absolutely. So you mentioned data security earlier as one of the concerns that we need to at least be concerned about. Maybe the Terminator world, not something we need to worry about. But when you think about concerns related to AI, are there other things that are on your radar where we say, we need to be at least cognizant of this potential risk so that we can avoid it if we see it coming?
Yeah, it's the human touch aspect, making sure that in law enforcement and in healthcare, things that are very, very personalized and that have humongous life or death impacts, that we have somebody that's at least looking over the reports and looking over the feedback that they get. And we talked about those in both of those hearings too, because again, I had a lot of questions and concerns, and it was great to hear that as they're piloting and trying things to see how it works, nothing goes forward without human eyes getting in there, touching it and reviewing it. And they said, okay, that's great. So that's reassuring. And that's very, very comforting.
Absolutely. And so we were together in the hearing when you did your report out and shared the recommendations of the committee. What are some of the things, have you heard anything privately from members of the legislature in terms of, hey, we really appreciate the direction you took on this, or maybe you could have done things a little bit differently? What kind of feedback have you gotten behind the scenes?
It's been a little bit of a mixed bag. A lot of people are very happy we didn't rush into anything, but there were certainly people that said, well, why wouldn't we? Right? Isn't that our job? We're lawmakers. Shouldn't we be making laws around this? And I said, well, this is a study committee. Our job is to study first and determine whether or not we needed to make the law. We determined we didn't. It's been a mixed bag. I think there were more outside people that were surprised we didn't, and more traditionalists, because again, these committees usually pump out quite a few bills and quite a few pieces of legislation. So I think there was a lot of just surprised that we didn't do that. But I stand on that. I'm proud of the fact that we didn't. I had conversations with every member of the committee one-on-one and shared, this is my vision. And if it changes during the process, happy to adjust.
That's why we have hearings, right? That's the goal.
To learn.
To learn. You got it.
If there had been something that the committee agreed that we should have pumped out, we would have. And that's something I'm super proud of, is that we did have ongoing conversations. And at no point did a majority of the committee come together and say, actually, we should do this bill. In fact, we had some bill ideas come up, but nothing, even to date, has come forward because it's not time yet. It's not ready yet. We're still studying. And that's the goal. We actually accomplished the goal of a study committee. We studied.
Yeah, it studied, and there are tremendous amounts of findings, right? So in as much as there wasn't a recommendation to regulate, we gathered a ton of information. All the hearings were public, of course, and some folks can go online and actually watch the hearings as they take place. I think those are all still out there. So
they are.
So very transparent process, of course, as it should be at the state level. I think another example of how Wisconsin is leading on artificial intelligence. We talk about a lot of the things happening here in Microsoft with their huge investment just southeast of your district and in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin, $3.3 billion data center. Mary Snapp, who is the vice president of strategy for Microsoft, joined us on the podcast to talk about that huge investment, bunches of things flowing out of that. We've got the AI Co-Innovation Lab at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, some great things going on at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, where we held one of our hearings, as a matter of fact. We had Jill Enos from Titletown Tech, a partnership between Microsoft and the Green Bay Packers on not long ago, talking about the great things happening in AI here in the state of Wisconsin. And I feel like another way in which we're leading, and we actually got credit from some of these other states, was thank goodness that you're taking the time to really be thoughtful about this. In fact, and going back to the conversation with the folks from Colorado, they were like, they started out with credit to the state of Wisconsin for actually studying this and thinking about it before they just asked their state legislature to come up with some regulation around artificial intelligence. So we really are in many ways leading here in the state of Wisconsin because of that, because of the advancement of AI, because of things like data centers. We've got challenges we've got to face too. I mean, in the world of AI, it consumes tremendous amount of energy. I'm a huge fan of Midjourney, which is an AI platform that can create an image of anything that you dream of, right? You just tell it, this is what I want to look at, and it'll give you 4 images of something that nobody on earth has ever seen before, just using AI and coming up with a depiction of what it is that you imagined in your head and managed to put into words. But folks don't realize every single AI-generated image requires the same amount of power as it does to charge your smartphone from 0 to 100%, right? I mean, a tremendous amount of energy just for that. And then you think about how much energy is the same to train one LLM is the same amount of energy that would be consumed by 133 homes here in the United States. And so tremendous amounts of energy. I know that is driving, and this is a key interest for you, thoughts about how do we create and how do we generate the energy that we need to generate and do it in a clean, environmentally responsible way and so on. And certainly outside looking in for me, nuclear is a huge opportunity, right? So let's get into that. And I know this is a fascination for you.
It is.
Talk a little bit about nuclear, how you got interested in it, what aspects of it, because there's a lot of things happening from fission to fusion to small modular reactors and so on. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I appreciate you bringing that up. I chair the Utilities, Technology, and Tourism Committee, and it's time.
That's an interesting combination.
It's a very interesting...
Utilities, technology, and tourism, right? That's a natural,
As chaired by a former professional wrestler.
Yeah, exactly.
So it all comes together very well. But nuclear, it's time. It's beyond time, right? There's a lot of work that needs to be done, regulatory work at the federal level, so that states can begin moving forward.
Sure.
But we're trying to take some steps here in Wisconsin. Myself and Representative Dave Steffen just passed a resolution, passed out of the Senate already with overwhelmingly bipartisan support, stating that Wisconsin is ready to move forward with nuclear energy.
Awesome.
Right? We're so far behind in where we could be. Wisconsin, we are net importers of energy.
Yeah.
So if we want to get our rates under control, if we want to be able to power these data centers and be a hub, which we do, we want everybody to come to Wisconsin.
Right.
Then we've got to get our energy consumption and our generation under control. Right. We've got to figure out how to hit consumption, and we've got to generate enough to be able to do so. And that's where nuclear comes in.
Yep.
I like to joke that I am a scientist because I have a political science degree.
There you go. Yeah.
But I'm not a scientist on some of these other things, right? But as I've continued to learn, I know SMRs are very exciting. We're open to everything. Right now, the state of Wisconsin, we've got to get to that point. We're trying to pass a bill right now about a siting study coming up. We're trying to get a summit here.
What is the siting study?
So getting in and determining what we can do, where we can do it, how we can bring nuclear and get some stuff up and running.
Okay.
So we're trying to get that figured out now, as well as having a summit. So getting people to come together. What is it going to take? What barriers can the state remove? So that when the feds open things up or when the opportunity arises, we can jump. We don't want to wait. We don't want to wait for everybody else to do it. Let's be as proactive as humanly possible, because that's how we're going to continue to attract business. That's how we're going to be able to lower rates. And that's how we're going to be able to be as responsible as we need to be when it comes to energy.
Sure. So let me ask a couple of follow-up questions. The first one that occurs to me is, so as you mentioned that the resolution that you brought to the state Senate passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. You didn't say unanimous, so that means that there's some outliers there. The people that are concerned about that, what are they saying? Somebody that would vote against a resolution like that, what would be the reason?
Yeah, only one person spoke against. So there were we have 33 members. There were 5 no votes, if I'm remembering correctly, and only one person spoke against. And he just said it just still not safe, I think was his concern. And there's a lot of that to still overcome. Right? There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of perception around nuclear. But overall, in general, if 10 years ago, I don't think you would have gotten a bipartisan resolution. Today, we think the governor, who's a Democrat, is willing to work with us on how can we open Wisconsin up, because I think everybody recognizes 2 things about energy here. One, as net importers, we have to be all of the above. We need everything. It gets really cold here in the winter. It's cold here today.
Exactly.
It gets really cold here in the winter, and it gets really hot in the summer. So we've got to be able to have energy that makes sure that all of our citizens are safe.
Absolutely.
So we need all of the above, which includes nuclear. Number 2, it's environmentally, it's clean.
Exactly.
It checks that box. The reactor that we have right now is providing energy for over 1 million homes.
That Point Beach?
That's all we have right now in the state of Wisconsin. Imagine. Imagine if we're able to grow that portfolio a little bit more and what additional energy we can provide. And again, if we're trying to attract more data centers, we're trying to attract more business, people are going to go, okay, but what's it going to look like? Because I need to turn the lights on.
So this resolution goes through the Senate, does then go to the other half of the legislature? Is that, So
the Assembly still needs to vote on it at some point. And I anticipate it's going to be wildly bipartisan as well. It's a statement. And that's what the resolution is. It's just a statement so that everybody knows that not only are we talking about it internally, but we're serious. We want to send up the bat signal, if you will, to everybody out there that says Wisconsin is serious about nuclear. Help us along the way, because we need to hear from the experts. Just like I was able to attract you and many other experts to come in and help us with AI. We need that help on nuclear. Because again, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, But I am somebody that can help the experts as we try to advance policy that'll open it up.
So for those of us, and I'm a little bit older than you are, but maybe more than a little bit, but lived through 3 Mile Island or remember Chernobyl, right? And that's immediately what you think about, right? I mean, those areas, Chernobyl still hasn't recovered, right? And it's certainly way better than it was, shortly after the event. What do you say to those folks? Has the technology changed? Are there reasons to be more optimistic about the safety of nuclear than maybe we had in the past?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's the technology has just changed so much, and we've learned from those, right? Those accidents, those horrible situations have led to a lot of changes and a lot of learning. The tsunami and people having to make changes after what happened in Japan. I just had a conversation about this and how it's impacted how the nuclear plants are built and the redundancies. Even if they're nowhere near a body of water, they all still have to comply to certain things because this is serious stuff, right? And so we're taking the opportunity to learn, to adapt, and to try to avoid something like that in the future. So I think it's time that we give it a shot. We give it a go. That's been my conversation. Is anything fully safe? No. I mean, we've learned that. But it is the job of the experts to make it as safe as humanly possible and for us to make sure that we provide enough regulation at a state level to ensure the safety of our citizens.
Absolutely. So as you look at those technologies and the advancements of technology, obviously nuclear now is fission technology. Have you looked at fusion at all? Are you interested, fascinated in that?
I've had some conversations. Again, it's quite a bit outside my scope, but I've had conversations. Everybody's excited on both sides.
Right.
And I'm just excited to get nuclear here in the state of Wisconsin.
Sure, absolutely. And excited for the future of really all of our commerce here. And to your point, if we can get to the point where we're not even a net exporter, but where we can generate our own energy needs right here in the state, that just continues to fuel growth. That's going to continue to fuel advancements in technology and to do it in a clean way. So to your earlier point, it is the cleanest way we really have right now of generating energy. The worst version of it, and still a significant part of the year still burns wood to heat their homes and to prepare their food. That's about the least efficient. And then you can move up through whether it's oil and fossil fuels or natural gas or alternative energy. And I mean, of all those, nuclear is the one, when done safely, that has the least environmental impact. And everybody should be able to agree on. So super, super excited about what the future holds in the world of nuclear. Excited about what the future holds in the state of Wisconsin from an education standpoint. Senator, I know this is a key interest of yours as well. I spend all of my time now in the technical and STEM education space. We say we're securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. I've yet to have a guest on the podcast or meet anybody else for that matter in the United States that says, that's a really bad idea. Let's not secure the American dream for the next generation. Everybody agrees on that. But to do that, we really have to focus on our education sector. And we started earlier in our discussion talking about how the environment in which you grow up and the example and the expectations and opportunities that your parents create for you, huge impact on what your opportunities are. I'm a big believer, having, grown up in an environment where I had blessings in my life that a lot of young people didn't have, that we've got this obligation to try and create those opportunities for as many Americans and in this case, as many Wisconsinites as possible. Talk a little bit about your thoughts on education. How are we doing here in the state of Wisconsin? What do we need to do better?
Yeah, we need to do a lot of things better. Literacy and math in a major way. We're too far behind.
Yeah.
The gap for Black students is the lowest. It's the worst in the entire
public
country.
Schools, it's just undeniable. The data's there. Yeah.
Our outcomes are just unacceptable, period. Right. And there's no level of success that's even in being talked about. It's like, well, we can get to 50%. 50% is not enough.
Of course not. Yeah.
That's nowhere near enough. We have to do better and we have to commit to it. Look, I'm a super fiscal conservative.
Sure.
I want to spend not a penny more than it costs to run our government.
Right.
But I also don't want to spend a penny less than it costs to actively, effectively, and efficiently run our government.
Sure.
So that means we have to continue to invest in education. That doesn't just mean throwing everything into public schools.
Right.
We have to diversify how we're doing that. If private schools are doing well, then we need to continue to fund that. I'm a big supporter of school choice.
Sure.
I believe school choice continues to help people. When you have a student that's stuck in a failing school, giving that parent and that student a lifeline is a responsible thing to do.
For sure.
School choice was born here in Wisconsin.
It was indeed.
And it was
Fuller.
bipartisan.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we have to remember that. And today it's bipartisan again. We saw that after the pandemic.
Yep.
We owe it to the students in schools today. I did. You mentioned it earlier. As I got older, I realized I did take my mom for granted as she was preparing me for the future because I had no idea. I had nothing to compare it to.
Sure.
Right. I thought every house in my block was having the same conversations and that they were just making different choices. But as you get older, you realize that there are parents that maybe don't know where to go or what to do. They maybe did not have a life where they saw the rest of the world, which is why the cycle continues.
Yep.
That's why schools are so important.
Right.
To have somebody else that can help the parents, right? When you think of education, it's got to be a partnership.
Yep.
Parents and educators and students.
For sure.
Everybody has to be part of this and the community has to be invested. We lived on public assistance off and on throughout my childhood. And at one point, I asked my mom why. Not why were we on public assistance, but why is the government giving us money? Because, as a kid, you start to have some awareness of your situation versus other people.
Absolutely.
And naturally, being inquisitive, I couldn't understand what's the incentive. And my mom put it in a way that has stuck with me forever. And she said, honey, the community is investing in you. They're not investing in me anymore. They're investing in you.
Yeah.
And so it's your job to finish school, get an education, and then pay it back with interest.
Fascinating.
And I've
What
kept
a wise
that.
thing for her to say. That's beautiful. Yeah.
It was incredible, and it's impacted. It's why I'm where I am today. I still don't like to pay taxes, but it's why I do it.
Right.
Right. And we need that to be the message that continues to spread through education. That's why literacy is so important. That's why comprehension is so important. And that's why it's got to be a top priority, if not the top priority.
Sure.
If we want to make sure that we have good citizens, regardless of what industry they go into and what they do for work in the workforce, and all of those things will come later.
Right.
Just good citizens, then we have to have great education.
No question.
I believe that's the beginning for us. We've got to do better. 31%. There are schools in Milwaukee that are single-digit percent that are proficient in reading and math. Those students are all being set up for failure. Right. It's unacceptable.
It is.
So we've got to continue to change it.
It's unethical.
It is unethical.
Right.
And we passed a big literacy bill last year that's changing how reading is being taught. That's a great first step. But we have a lot more to do.
So let's talk about MPS, right? So, you mentioned the results, and we've got other challenges in the state of Wisconsin. But I grew up in and around the city, had a lot of friends that went to MPS schools growing up. Still know kids that are in that program. And there's certainly some shining examples of students that are doing well in MPS, and shining examples in Milwaukee Public Schools, and shining examples of schools that are doing really, really well. I had somebody ask me, we were actually on vacation with 5 couples from the state of Wisconsin 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they said, if you were given free reign over that school district and could do anything that you wanted, what would you do to improve outcomes in Milwaukee Public Schools? I'm going to ask you the same question, Senator. If somebody put you in there and they said you can do, whatever constraints you're concerned about, whatever, bargaining units, whatever union, whatever administration, whatever student challenges, knowing that we're pulling into that district a group of students that probably don't have the same opportunities coming into school that maybe you get in other parts of the state. What are a couple things you would do in MPS if you could change anything?
Yeah, so I'd introduce competition in any way possible.
Okay.
And by introducing competition, I don't just mean, school choice, but I mean in the classroom, right? Teachers competing to get the best grades for their students.
Sure.
Qualifying for better wages.
Yep.
Right? Like it is in the private sector.
Sure.
If you do well at your job, you make more money.
Yep.
Right?
For sure.
We would get and become way more outcome driven. That's something that I think is missing right now. Students aren't being held back on a regular basis. So they're failing forward. If you can't read by 3rd grade, you're in a whole lot of trouble. Up through 3rd grade, you learn to read. From 3rd grade, from 4th grade beyond, you're reading to learn.
Right.
And
wow, that's interesting.
And we're
Did
passing.
you come up with that on your own?
I didn't.
Okay, that's good.
But we're passing students out of 3rd grade that can't read. Well, how can they possibly succeed?
Sure.
So we've got to put more incentives on, not just testing. All testing does is show us it's a reflection of where we are today, right? It's like any other survey. Okay, so here's where we are. Got it. How do we improve that?
Sure.
And we've got to do more. We've got to raise standards, not lower them. We've got to set clear expectations, and we have to be serious about it.
Yep.
We have to stick to it. We can't just say, well, it's taking too long, or I'm not seeing instant results, so maybe we should change something.
Right.
Let's create a plan. We can be adaptable. We can be flexible. But we've got to create a real plan. And so that would be the first thing I would do. They have so many problems in MPS.
Right.
It's nearly impossible to address it all. But there are so many great dedicated teachers too. And I don't want to just call out all the issues, because there are real awesome professionals
100%.
who are doing this for all the right reasons. And they're just running into roadblocks. They get lumped in with everybody else too. And I don't want them to think that they're the problem, because they're definitely not. There are other resources that are necessary, and I want to be part of providing those. So I get to do whatever I want. We're introducing competition.
Yep.
We're introducing incentives because we've got to do it. It's what we would do if we're trying to attract business.
Yep.
Right? We introduce incentives, tax breaks, et cetera. So let's introduce competition. Let's open up school choice so that you can take your child, the money's following your kid everywhere you want to go.
Yep.
And in the public schools, if you're one of those great teachers that continues to do awesome, let's recognize you.
Sure.
Let's make you qualify for a bump in pay so that other teachers go, you know what, I really want to try to do that.
Yep.
And understanding, and you mentioned it, and I talked about it a little bit as well, and every student has the home environment to help facilitate growth in education.
Sure. Yep.
So how can we overcome that would become the next piece. I've been to some private schools where they bring parents in and they say, you have to be part of this in order for your child to attend this school.
Yep.
It's difficult to require that in public schools.
For sure.
But that doesn't mean we can't encourage it.
100%.
It doesn't mean we can't create the programs that make that happen and put pressure on parents to be more engaged in their child's education. So those are just a few of the things I would do. And, if we can save one extra kid by just doing those things, and it was successful.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned parents, huge role for parents. Glad you mentioned teachers. And I agree 100%. And as much as in some cases in discussions like this, we lump all the teachers together, just some shining examples of the way that educators are changing students' lives outside of MPS and inside of MPS. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily appreciate the challenges that a teacher has, especially in this day and age. I'm working really closely with a school district in Western Wisconsin. I was talking to the district administrator, the superintendent of that district, and he said this a couple of weeks ago, and it just blew me away. He said, anymore, if we look at like a freshman class in high school, and you walk into a typical classroom that is teaching freshman level, you fill in the blank, math, English, history, whatever. He said the comprehension and the reading and academic ability of the students in that individual classroom will span from second grade. So some of them will be reading at a second grade level, and others will be reading at a freshman in college level in exactly the same classroom. And you think about being a teacher and walking in and simultaneously having to challenge that high flyer that's doing work that at a collegiate level, and also provide support and nurture for that student that is, for whatever reason, and some of them through no fault of the students, probably many of them, at a completely different level. And it really opened my eyes to me. I can't imagine being a teacher and having to work in that environment, which I think speaks to when we get the ones that shine, when we get the ones that have the capability of inspiring students for these crazy outcomes and bringing them from one level to another. And there's so many teachers that do that. Let's reward that work.
Absolutely. And to your point, I hear that from teachers all the time, from second grade all the way up to collegiate level. How? I think we have to change. It's time to adapt and change what the school looks like. Right? If you have kids that are performing at a high level, let's get them in classes that do that. Calling everything first grade, second grade, third grade, fifth grade. We need to re-examine that. It's okay to do that, right? We created that system. We can create a new one that fits where we are today. Technology has changed education.
Exactly.
Kids have cell phones all the time. They're constantly reading. They're constantly learning. We need to tap into that more and utilize those tools. And I think there's a lot of ways to do it. We just have to be brave enough and willing to break out of the norm and say, this isn't working. Let's try something. And then as soon as we nail it, let's scale it.
So I'm so glad to hear you say that. I was on this panel last night at Marquette University, and one of the questions that was posed to me is, what is education going to look like in the future? And I said a couple of things. The first thing, and this isn't original to me, I heard it somewhere else, but it's so true. You walk into the average elementary school now, middle school, and I had the opportunity a few years back to walk through my childhood elementary school. Hadn't been there for over 40 years. Went back, and it was awesome. Smelled exactly the same. All the drinking fountains were in. I walked into my kindergarten room, and it's like everything was the same. The cubbies were in the same spot. The little carpet, and then it was really cool. And then it occurred to me, it's like, oh my goodness, the whole world has changed, and the school that I went to, elementary school, 40 plus years ago, looks exactly the same. And oh, by the way, looks exactly the same as it did like post-World War II. That building was built in the late 1920s. And so it really gives you a sense for how much the world has changed and how much maybe in some cases education hasn't. And what I told the students, these were all human resources students last night, and kind of talking about how are they going to recruit people into their organizations in the future. And I said, what's going to happen in education is that in the old days, and even now, We go to school to learn, right? Sage on the stage, brilliant person that stands up in front of us and lectures for 50 minutes, writes on a board, whatever, does demonstrations. And then we go home to practice, right? That's the model now. We come to school to learn and we go home to practice. And when we say practice, we call it homework. I mean, we literally put the name home right in what we're doing. And we study for exams at home. And then we come back and then we, prove competency when we come back to do our exam. And I said, what's going to happen is that's going to flip. And home is going to be the place where we go to learn. There's a reason I can blow 45 minutes on TikTok or YouTube Shorts because it's fun, right? And you just, I flip through it. And as soon as it loses my interest, boom, I'm on to the next thing. That, I think, is what education looks like. We're going to learn at home that way. As soon as I got it, I've got that concept, on to the next one, or I need a little bit more time, let's watch that again.
Yeah.
And then we're going to come to school to practice. And we're going to do our hands-on skills, and we're going to do our interactive, let's talk about what we learned. Let's show what we're capable of doing. Let's talk about the meaning of what we just read. And so I think that's the future of education, which to me is really, really exciting, but requires a whole different view of education.
It does. It's super exciting. And it's what's next.
Yep, exactly.
Right. It's what's next. We were talking about this during the study committee, but we know that right now, as AI continues to expand, we're trying to get workers in to get caught up and be able to go.
Yep.
And then we've got to teach it in college.
Yep.
And then get it into the high schools.
Right.
Eventually, we're going to be teaching kids in elementary school because it's a lot easier to learn and it's going to be so much a part of their daily lives.
Totally.
Right. So why aren't we thinking about that today?
Exactly.
That should be how we're planning this for the future because they're playing with it at home, just as you said.
Exactly.
So let's make sure they can utilize the skills they're learning.
Yep.
And then teach them the ones they're missing. Right. Schools, especially when we get into high schools, I think high school needs to be completely revamped.
Yeah, blow it up, figuratively.
Yes.
Yeah, start over.
I think it needs to be completely revamped to get kids ready for whatever is next in their lives.
100%.
It needs to do a better job of not just passing you out, you're an adult now, you're 18, best of luck.
Yep.
Sorry, we didn't teach you how to balance a checkbook,
right?
Which that's a whole other topic.
It
Economic literacy
for sure.
is a real issue. But I think we need to do, if you know that you're going to go into any industry, any vocation, if you know that already,
right,
we should be specializing.
For sure.
We should have relationships that say, okay, you know what? You're ready to go. We're going to put you on this path.
Yep.
And you could still change your mind.
Right.
Because a lot of kids don't know in high school.
Totally.
But we've got to introduce them to what's available to them and to what's out there. And that's a great way to do it. You take your gen eds maybe in the morning and your whole afternoon is practical.
Right.
You're out, you're trying, you're an apprentice, you're interning. It's more hands-on. And I think that is how you're going to create a better workforce and a better citizen, somebody that's ready to make that decision when the time comes. It goes, you know what, I interned here, I was an apprentice. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I'll try something else. But now I know who to call. Yep. Now I know who to talk to.
Totally. Yeah.
When I graduated, I didn't know who to call or talk to for a lot of these things. And the internet was in its infancy still.
Right.
That's available. So let's encourage that and really show people what some of these jobs can do for them, what these careers can be. These aren't just tasks. These are careers.
And those people want to help. I mean, that's the thing I tell people all the time, they're like, well, sometimes I'm a little bit skittish or a little bit sheepish, I should say, about reaching out to some CEO of a company or a head of HR or this chief engineer or whatever. It's like, if you can get to those people, they want to help you, right? I never say no to a student who says, can I have 15 minutes? Not once. Happy, always happy to do it. There's this effort that I've been involved with again in Western Wisconsin. You and I've talked about it. It's all around self-paced, student-centered learning, right? What they're doing is they've got a course. There's a 16-hour course that a student goes through about applied artificial intelligence. So they're learning some of the terminology of AI. They're starting with their smartphone and recognizing that, yes, your smartphone's tracking everything you're doing, sending that information up to, for example, Spotify, which is why Spotify is able to, at any moment, play exactly the song you want to hear at that moment without you having any idea why, because it knows everything about you. Starting with that and then saying, okay, here's how artificial intelligence manifests itself in autonomous vehicles or autonomous mobile robots or industrial robotics or unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, or programming or coding and so on, and putting the students through these experiences on a self-paced schedule. So a student needs a little more time. They get to spend a little more time. If they want to go faster, they go faster. 45 hours each, 12 experiences altogether, and creating what they're calling a competency portfolio for that student. So yeah, it's awesome to have a transcript and a diploma for leaving high school. What do you really know how to do?
Right.
What are your interests? How can I take the area where you're naturally gifted, and that tends to be the areas where we really enjoy the work that we're doing. And if we're enjoying the work, that tends to be where we excel. How do we figure out what that is, help you figure that out as a student, and put you on that career pathway that's perfect for you, that's going to be rewarding, so you don't have to look back over your shoulder when you're 40 years old and say, oh, I wish I would have done A, B, or C.
You talked about how I got into wrestling, right? How I decided I wanted to go do that to try to make some money. There was a quote I heard, and that's literally what led me to wrestling. It's, what do you love to do? Find something you love and get paid to go do it.
Yes.
Right? And I was like, well, I love wrestling. Yeah. Wrestling's paying a lot of money right now. Right? But we have to help. There's a lot of kids that don't think like that. Right? I try to mentor my nephews and nieces constantly as they were coming through school. What do you like to do? Just what is it that you like to do? Forget the expectations. What do you like to do? Because this is your life. Right? You get one crack at this thing. So what is it you want to do? What makes you wake up and go, all right, let's go do this thing? And that's what I've tried to preach, and that's what I try to do. Right. Like, I knew I wanted to give back, but I also, I worked in broadband for a long time. I worked for CenturyLink, CenturyTel, Lumen, a lot of name changes now, but I worked there for a long time as I tried to figure that out. But I got valuable experience in working in the corporate world, which was something I wanted. For sure. And I had the opportunity to make very good money, but I knew I wanted to be in service. I wanted to give back. I felt a calling to do it and a need to do it. And that's why I'm doing this now. And I want other people to know that. I want other people to realize that you can change things as you go along. You can adapt. You can do those things. But if you find the thing you love, stick with it. Exactly. Do it. And we've got to do a better job. You nailed it in high school. You get a diploma and a transcript. Fantastic. Congratulations. Right. But what have we prepared you for? Exactly. And I don't think we're preparing kids well today. We've got to prepare them for what it's going to look like when they're 19, not just when they're 18. There's no question. There's examples of schools that are doing it relatively well, but so far to go, so much ground to cover. And speaking of ground to cover, I feel like we could spend another hour covering ground, right? And sadly, we're kind of rolling into the end of our time together, Senator. What a fascinating conversation we've had. And I do want to pose one last question to you before we wrap up here. And I think it's a perfect segue from what we just talked about, which is your career journey, where you ended up following your passions, finding these creative ways to advance your career, to do good, to find yourself in an area where you're performing incredible service to your constituents, to the state of Wisconsin, and so on. But we all have things that we maybe wish we learned a little bit earlier. And so we love asking and finishing our podcast with this last question. And it's going all the way back in time, before you're a senator, before you're in broadband, before you're in professional wrestling, and you're 15-year-old, you don't have the senator name in front of you, you're Julian Bradley, you've got your whole life in front of you. If you could go back and give that young man one piece of advice, what would it be? That's always a great question. Aside from trying to slip him some lottery numbers. There you go, right? That's always the fun one. Buy Apple, right? Right. Right. Any number of exactly crypto, right? Bitcoin. Nice. One word. I would tell him to be confident. Yeah. In whatever it is that you want to do, just remain confident. Because perseverance is the most valuable lesson I've learned. It's probably one of my favorite words. So I would just, especially at 15, that's a real good time. Just hang in there, persevere, and be confident. Perseverance and confidence. You've exuded both of those certainly throughout your career, Senator, and your time today with us on the Tech Ed Podcast. I'm confident, by the way, that our audience got a ton out of this episode, talking about education, talking about nuclear, talking about AI, talking about professional wrestling. We covered a tremendous amount of ground with State Senator Julian Bradley from my home state of Wisconsin. So happy that he was able to join us on this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. While you are wrapping your time up with us, be sure to check out our show notes. We have the best show notes in the business, and so some of the references that we made over the course of this discussion, we'll be sure to link those up in the show notes. Check them out, and be sure to engage with us on social media, whether that's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, whether it is LinkedIn, TikTok, wherever you consume your social media. We would love to see you. Reach out, let us know you're out there. By the way, those show notes that we mentioned, the show notes for the episode can be found at techedpodcast.com/Bradley. That is techedpodcast.com/BRADLEY. See them there, and we will see you next week on the Tech Ed Podcast. Thanks for joining us.